So if anyone here has ever picked up an action figure in the G.I. Joe line, and I'm pretty sure every single one of you has, that character was in some way partially defined, and an adventure that that character went on was partially written by this man right here, Mr. Larry Hama. He wrote the majority of the original Real American Hero line, comic line, sorry. Also the special missions. He's been brought back by IDW to write the current G.I. Joe Real American Hero continuation. He's been writing G.I. Joe for a long time. He wrote the majority of the file cards. He probably knows more about G.I. Joe than any one person that has worked on the brand ever. And so he is also an artist, an editor for Marvel. He has been all over the comic industry. And you let the people get to ask him any questions you have about G.I. Joe, about the comic industry, and just hear his wonderful tales. So if I can get any questions for Mr. Larry Hama. All right, let's do it.
I've also considered the world's foremost authority, Conan the Barbarian, by people that own the property.
Wow. So even I'm learning something today.
It was Dave Soder, the lawsuit also.
If no one minds, can I ask the first question? Can you tell me more about that? What happened there?
I was hired as an expert witness by Conan Properties, people that own the property.
And why did they think you were an expert witness?
Well, they submitted an affidavit saying that I was the world's foremost authority on Conan. And also that I was the world's foremost authority on voice action figures. So this is in court records. I'm sure it is. It's open, you can check. That's the name of the situation.
All right, excellent. So, it's open to the room. There's a lot of smiling people here. I know you all know Larry Hama. Yes, start us off. I'll get to it. All the comics you've ever written, are we talking about issues, stories, or just like the G.I. Joe lines? Okay, so of all the comics you've written, which one was your favorite?
Probably the G.I. Joe silent issue. I mean, what single issue? Yeah. I wrote it, drew it. I wish it were all as easy to do as that.
So what was it about that issue that stands out as your favorite?
It was sort of done under duress. It was done that way because they were late. You needed the book done ultra quick. So if you don't have it lettered, in those days, before attachments and JPEGs, you had to physically send pages around the country. So by not having any lettering, you'd save a complete week of the production schedule. It also saved time if I wrote it and drew it simultaneously. I was doing those layouts right on the board. So there was no script, there was no real pencil. It was what they call breakdowns. I did it over the course of 3 days.
Wow.
They were sent to Steve Lealoha in San Francisco, FedEx. So I think we got the whole book out. Written pencil, less than 2 weeks. Not happy.
How does that compare to the usual turnaround time in the comics in those days?
Less than half. It's not the fastest I've ever done. The fastest I've ever done was a Marvel Comics James Bond movie adaptation. I see. And I think I wrote that, how to shape the pencil, the 48 pages. So it was twice the length. More than twice the length. We did it from having absolutely nothing to having it being ready to ship in 1 week.
Wow.
That may be a
So you could say pressure makes diamonds.
No, it's a matter of, in that case, they got 3 guys who were very fast. All of them at one point. Which is not an occurrence.
Yes.
Hey, with your ongoing series, which I'm very glad to we have now, the question comes to mind. I know you wrote the declassified series for DDP, which the DDP line being now disavowed. Do you consider the declassified still to be sort of the official part of your ongoing series?
Do I consider the
G.I. Joe Declassified that you wrote?
Yeah.
Do you still consider that the origins for the Marvel series that you're considering now, IDW?
No, that has nothing to do with the Marvel side. I mean, there's something like 5 or 6 distinct continuities that exist. There are like multiple G.I. Joe universes. I even considered, personally, I thought Special Missions was a slightly different universe than the regular G.I. Joe universe. That's how I structured it in my head. Now, the current IDW continuation of RAH is a direct continuation on that storyline as it picks up as it continues from 155, and it posits that all the other universes don't exist in this particular one because it predates them all, and it starts to get very confusing. I have to sort of incorporate everything else into it. Actually, I did this before with Wolverine. I took on doing the Wolverine comic without ever having read any previous Wolverine stuff. So, since I don't like to read comics very much, I just went into the X-Men office and talked to the assistants. Well, tell me what's really important. You know, you've got like 20 minutes. And then I went out and I read the Barry Smith and the Frank Miller and Kirkman Claremont. And I jettisoned everything else. I figured, well, if Claremont, Smith, and Miller didn't write it, then I was going to just ignore it. Because it didn't seem like canon. So that was sort of retconning and sort of editing on my part for a major character that I did for 8 years. I just totally ignored everything else that had been done. And, so basically, they had to go with what I had done. That's how it helped me.
And just double check, that was when you were writing over in the early 90s?
I did a straight run. I think it started. I know it did about 8 years.
Excellent. Yes?
What's one of the first file cards you can remember writing for one of the early characters?
I think the actual physical first one was probably Grunt. It was a storyboard. It was an infantry. And that was probably the hardest one to do because well, first of all, I didn't originally write them as copy for the back toy package. When I took on the G.I. Joe project, I realized that they were going to add new toys and characters every year. But as we went on more than a couple of years, it would be 24, 30 characters, which is even more than the Avengers had at the time. So, well, I can't even keep track of the Avengers. So, since these were characters that had never been around, they were like brand new, there wasn't learned biography or it's hard to explain, but like you get to know characters in comic strips and comic books totally incrementally. The daily strip, you have like 3 or 4 panels. That's it. And so you learn this minuscule, tiny little bit of information about this character every day, but then you learn it for like 10 years or something. One thing, when I was an editor, I used to ask my writers, how long have you been reading Peanuts? They would say, well, all my life. Oh, it's like, well, I've been reading this comic strip for 20 years. Can you tell me what happens exactly in one Sunday Peanuts strip? Just anyone? And they all go, well, they're playing baseball, at least these pitching. They can remember all these things, but they can't remember the plot. But if you ask these same people, well, what's Lucy like? They can tell you what's Linus like, what is his character. So you've learned all this stuff about these characters, these tiny little bits. It's the same thing with comics. You don't learn who Batman is by reading one issue of Batman. You don't learn who Superman is by reading one issue of Superman. You little by little, gain this sort of weird encyclopedic knowledge of these characters. And none of this existed with G.I. Joe characters. So I said, well, I have to create that myself so that it's there, so that I know who these people are. So I started writing what I call a dossier, because I didn't call it a file price. I said, well, I'll create a dossier for each character. And it was like a file, it was like what the U.S. Army calls a 201 file. It was a personnel file. And it had in it like documents like peer assessments, which were assessments of this character written by other characters in the other characters' voices. So that was one way for me to establish how these people spoke and what they thought of each other. Another document in the dossier was a psychological assessment by a fictitious psychiatrist. Then there was a report from a superior officer. So it was, and then the usual data, where he went to school, what training he had, stuff like that. So these were things that really cemented who these characters were in my head. So and I was just doing it for myself. It was a tool for me to keep the characters consistent. The easiest way that I found to always keep the character consistent was to base a character on somebody I knew. So they're all basically either people I know personally or they're based on some actor or famous character in fiction. But they're mostly people, regular people. I mean, that way, I can't veer off the course. know what he would say in any given circumstance. If you base characters on people you know and you're familiar with, then you've always got a point of reference. But if you're making up a character out of the blue, that point of reference is always shifting. You're liable to just like make up stuff, that's really about character, just to fit a plot. And to tell you the truth, I can't remember a single plot that I've ever written. Because the plots are not important. In fact, I don't know what happens to the story on the next page until I write that page. If I'm writing page 5, I have no idea what happens on page 6. I don't know what happens in the last page until I get to the last page. This is because when I read books or other comics, sometimes I get to page 3 and I go, oh, okay, I know what happens at the end. That sucks out all of this out of that. Why do I take no further? But there are some writers that I read that at the end of each chapter I go, what is going to happen now? I have to keep reading. Cormac McCarthy was one of these guys. Just go, wow. You have to keep going. I try to do that page by page. I end every page. A scene ends at the end of a page. And the end of a scene is always some sort of cliffhanger. It doesn't have to be danger, but there has to be something, an unanswered question in the last panel of the page, which makes you subconsciously go, I have to turn the page. If you don't have that, then you get to the end of the book and you go, well, why have I done this? Does that answer your original question, or maybe
Yes, for the hands. Go ahead. Okay, so which one is your favorite character?
I'll say, guys, it's the easiest to write. Not just because he doesn't speak, but I like everything about him. So I don't write stories thinking of them as words, because I didn't start out to be a writer. I was a drawer. I don't use the word artist. I think the word artist is an appellation, not a job description. I think you could call yourself an artist. That's sort of like calling yourself a poet. No, I'm sorry. You're just a person that writes rhymes. It's up to other people to make that designation, not yourself. I drew for a long time. I drew storyboards, illustrations. I had illustrations in Esquire and Rolling Stone and other magazines before I did comic book. I did storyboards for advertising, big advertising agencies. And that's where I really learned how to tell sequential stories. Stories with sequential pictures. And that's how I think of the stories. I see my stories in my head as visual stories, like sort of silent movies. And when I see the whole story laid out like that, as a series of pictures, I write the plot by describing in words what I see. A lots of times I started out writing comics just by doing the layouts and like scribbling in notes of what the characters might say. So I'm always thinking in terms of telling the story completely with the pictures. That's why the silent issue is sort of a condensation of that thinking. When I actually write dialogue, that's all I write. I rarely write a caption that's more than the meanwhile in Washington, ... I think this goes back to when I was just drawing comics. And I would draw like a really ornate panel showing the sunset coming over the Himalayas, ice flows, and Arctic birds, and reflections in the ice. And the writer would like write the caption that big, describing all that in words, covering up the actual picture, which I thought, oh, this guy is just, he's putting down words to make the money. He's not participating in making this work as a unified piece. When comics work, you can't separate the words from the pictures or anything else. It should be all of the piece. Even the balloons. The shape of the balloons to me is very important. It's ugly balloon shape. The lettering is ugly. So balloons. The whole thing has to be.
Dave.
Back in the mid to late 90s, there was a terrific comic book explosion where the comic market was very hot. During that time, several artists broke away from Marvel and DC and joined Image Comics. Rob Liefeld had Youngblood. I don't know if you've ever read his work, but based on what you're describing, he was very heavy into the graphics and very light on dialogue. How do you feel about that kind of storytelling?
Well, I think there's at the time there was sort of a real schism in comics. There was this totally reactionary thing of like star artists. So just like, well, the writing is irrelevant. So you got all these these comics that have lots of posing characters, voguing and posing, and very little story, and very little character. To me, character is everything. The story, the plot is a vehicle to hang these great characters on. I think this works with literature too. It's like it goes back to not being able to remember the plot. You can't remember the plot of Dickens novels. I don't think he really thought about his plots. He was doing his weekly installments for newspapers on a deadline. That's why Dickens novels are full of like extremely wild coincidences. They're just, what? They're just walking down the beach and the guy like washes ashore. It's like, oh my God. But you like these characters so much that you don't care. And the same holds true for stuff like Harry Potter. If you start examining the logic or the plot, it just all falls apart. You like these characters so much that you want to come back and find out more about them and enjoy the story as it goes. But once you start like examining stuff, well, wait a second. if they could like just go and use these flues and just like transport to anywhere, why did they get on the stupid train? But if you start picking stuff like that apart like that, it takes the fun out. You accept all that stuff. You let it slide because you like those people. You want to come back.
Yes, John.
I've noticed recently in comics there's been more of a shift towards using the caption boxes for sort of first-person narration from the main character instead of having expository captions. And this has reduced the amount of expository dialogue as well. What are your thoughts on this shift?
I started that. When I started writing G.I. Joe, all of Marvel Comics was something like 50% captions. And it wasn't first person. It was omniscient narrator. Some narration, the voice of God or something. He's telling you what was going on, supposed to be going on in the pictures. But I rejected that. I just said, well, it's only going to be dialogue, and the story has to be told in the pictures, and very short captions. When I took over, and no thought balloons. I got rid of thought balloons. This was considered anathema at the time. I got a lot of flack. But within less than 10 years, it became the norm. That old style of like lots of headed captions disappeared. Nobody does it. When I started doing Wolverine, I realized, okay, some of this stuff has to be explained somehow. So I started using first-person captions. And so the only captions in Wolverine that I did were first-person captions of Wolverine speaking. And that was considered wacky at the time. But now it's like come around. So I don't get credit.
Yes, get the cover flanking sheet.
Was there ever a character outside of G.I. Joe or Wolverine or Daredevil that you would have liked to have written or drawn a story for?
That I didn't write?
That you didn't, but you would have liked to have, given a shot at it.
Oh, absolutely. Uncle Scrooge. The reason I got into comics was I wanted to do ducks. I'm a duck guy. The only duck I ever got to do was in Bucky O'Hare. But I loved the Karl Barks Uncle Scrooge stuff as a kid. That's what I thought of as being good comics. And it was all the same stuff that I just been talking about. It was, you could look at those things and not read it and tell what was going on and like those characters. And there was a complete suspense. They were ducks. And you sort of believed it and got into it. I thought, wow, this is really terrific. This is what I wanted to do. But in the late 60s and early 70s, when I was trying to get into comics, nobody was buying ducks. It was all superheroes. And even, I started out working in undercover in New York and in London in the late 60s. And even they didn't do ducks.
By the way.
As IDW owns both, not owns, but has both the licenses for G.I. Joe and Transformers,
Yes.
do you think there's any chance of you doing a Transformers story down the line? You could totally make a duck transformer.
Well, not really, since I don't know that much about. I do enough at one point to be able to write one or two issues of G.I. Joe Transformers crossover. But that was back when it was still the universes were still fairly simple. knew who Optimus Prime was. I knew, well, you know, I mean, I knew who these characters were just from sort of induction. But the universe has gotten so complicated that I don't know if I can even. I don't think I can even go back and do Wolverine. I've not read a single issue of Wolverine since I stopped writing. So, you know, Marvel stopped sending me the bundles a long time ago. So, you know, I don't go to comic shops and buy comics. It's like somebody hands me to me and says, "Hey, it's free. I'll take it." I'm not, you know, plugging down money.
Yes.
Yeah, hey Larry. I was thinking, Hasbro now owns the rights to the Marvel line of action figures, and they're doing G.I. Joe.
The which?
Hasbro, they're now up doing all the Marvel.
They don't own. They've licensed.
They've licensed the characters, yeah, the Marvel characters. And since Marvel still, technically, as far as I understand, has Ant-Man as a property, which I would love to see them reprint. One of my favorite comic books. I think it's possible.
That's sort of a cult thing. It's not. It never entered public consciousness.
So good.
Even though they owned it, they never promoted it, and they, you know, they never. I mean, it was meant to be a graphic novel. I wrote it so that it could actually be collected and work as a graphic, as a real, that was the length of real novel. And it was never meant to be a forever ongoing series. It was supposed to like go 24 issues, and then that would be it, at the beginning, a middle, and an end. You know, it was canceled way before then. And I had to sort of wrap up the entire end in like one issue. But I'm sure that the powers that be at Marvel don't even know it exists. The powers that be at all the companies have no idea what's in their archives. You know, DC Comics have negatives of Michael Golden stories that they never printed. That got sort of shunted off into this netherworld because they didn't know who Michael Golden was at that time. They didn't like his stuff because the heads were too big. These things happen. You know, then new regimes come in and everything is forgotten.
Well, my thought was that maybe since Hasbro is doing Marvel toys right now and they're doing G.I. Joe, you know, is there somebody that we could petition to at Hasbro to say do an Ant-Man figure, cross over G.I. Joe Marvel? I think that would. If I went to Hasbro,
You have to understand the economics of the toy industry is such that it costs so much money to tool, and just to make a tooling to whatever. That's why there's so many action figures of any book that are cannibalized. Nothing makes the toy industry happy than say, well, let's just take the format and make it black. That doesn't require any work at all. That just requires changing the color of the plastic pellets you're putting into the hopper. You know, that's the stuff they really love. You know, but having to have a designer design a new thing and then have it molds made and tooling up costs an immense amount of money. You know? And you have to remember also that it's all about the vehicles. That it's not a secret. You know, they mentioned this at Hasbro panels all the time. Is that Hasbro Hasbro itself never considered G.I. Joe an action figure line. They considered it a vehicle line. Right? The action figures are sort of loss leaders. You know, they're there so that you want to buy the vehicles, because all the profit margin is in the vehicles. So in real life terms, the G.I. Joes, the action figures, are the McDonald's hamburgers, and the vehicles are the sodas. You know, McDonald's breaks even on the burgers and fries. They make all their profit on sodas.
Interesting facts.
It's the facts of life.
Right here, sunglasses.
Hi. I had a question for you about, I had read a long time back that, I don't know if it's true or not, but it had said that you had something to do with writing for the characters in the Cops line back in the day from Hasbro. I don't know if it's true or not.
Cops. Yeah, I wrote the file for it.
Yeah, that's cool. Was it all of them, or do you think?
At least the first year was maybe into the second year. I vaguely like Tommy Two-Tone.
Yeah. Buttons that could move.
Yeah. That's all my writing.
That's cool.
And if I'm not mistaken, wasn't there some connection between one of the characters and Beachhead? He had like the same last name, and it mentions in his file card he had an uncle that was a ranger.
Boy, I can't even remember.
Yeah, and I wish I had more details. Anyone with an iPhone can look it up on Wikipedia right now while we take the next question.
What was your experience, just following up on that, of the synergy between toy design and comic book writing, and then the whole world of toy marketing and the TV show? How did that work, and was it frustrating or was it exciting?
Well, as a kid, I was always bothered by the fact that stuff didn't match up. I mean, that was the whole genesis of Bucky O'Hare. I sat down and I figured out what the toys would do first. Then I based what the characters looked like on what was needed.
The character
The manufacturing process for the toys. You know, that like, oh, you should really use more than 3 colors. Oh, you know, you can't have these complex concavities. You know, that's why the comic book character of Bucky O'Hare has 3mm holes in the bottom of the ski. Instead of holsters, he has these 3mm plugs that stick out of his belt. That all the weapons and accessories have 3mm holes. This was, I think, I did the first stuff on Bucky O'Hare in 1977. It didn't really. That was a property that took something like 14 years to get kicked off. Maybe because Neil Adams really stuck to it. And I originally did it as a supposedly creator-owned property of DC Comics. But my lawyer at the time was the same guy who was Siegel and Schuster's lawyer, who won the case for Superman against DC. But he said, don't hand over anything until they show you the actual contract. DC never caught up the contract, so I never handed over any Bucky O'Hare stuff. The Neil Adams finally said, look, I'll bankroll this. originally it was going to be me writing and penciling it, and Neil Adams inking it. And we were set to start the first issue, and Michael Logan better him than us.
So before the next question, we have follow up on the cops.
The cop Checkpoint is Beachhead's son.
There we go.
Yeah.
Over here, by the wall.
Could you give us any insight into, I believe you wrote the Storm Shadow ongoing series for the issues where you had the midget sidekick?
Where I had the what?
Midget sidekick?
You had a Storm Shadow ongoing series from Devil's Due a couple of years ago, and Storm Shadow had a midget sidekick.
Oh,
And so you're just looking for insight or trivia? Or, yeah. Okay, so just any story you have about that.
a little person. To be politically correct. Yeah, that sort of came about by. See, everything I write is page by page retcon. Like I said, I had no idea what is coming next. So I started a story where his supposed niece gets kidnapped. And then somewhere along the line I said, well, what if she's not really his niece? That's what starts this stuff. When people think that I came up with this whole ninja clan and then constructed all this backstory about them and then started slowly feeding in. It's the exact opposite. It's true. I got to a certain page, number 21, and I said, well, wouldn't it be cool if they both tore their sleeves and they both had the same tattoo on their forearm? I guess I'll use hexagram 63 of the E shape because it's totally symmetrical and I can remember. That's the only reason I chose it. I think I had used it once previously at Iron Fist. It's like on the chest of the coat brother. The Iron Fist origin. But I had no idea what it signified at the time. I just thought, oh, okay, this is cool. They both had this on their forearms. People will wonder why. But then, then later on, I had to make up the reason why it was there. Which to me works. My methodology for writing a story, a G.I. Joe story, is to just get them into some terrible situation at the beginning, and then at the end of 22 pages, try to figure out a way to get them out of it. I got the inspiration for that reading an article years ago about Robert E. Howard, who told. I think he told this to H.P. Lovecraft, that the reason that he liked writing Conan the Barbarian was that he really didn't have to think about it. He wasn't solving complex mysteries that were. The way Conan got out of a situation was he took out his sword and killed everybody. Very straightforward stuff, very cause and effect, very logical, and not involved with thinking up writerly things. Your energies are free to do all this other stuff, which is what I think really made Conan popular. Conan Manga isn't going on for page after page, thinking about philosophy. He's just dealing with situations. And, I like that. He's not dealing with concepts. He's not dealing with feelings. He's not dealing with any of these things. He's just dealing with this guy who's very sort of practical and pragmatic. He deals with stuff as it happens and isn't like making long-term plans.
We have time for a couple more questions. Yes?
When I read the Free Comic Book Day 155.5, I was curious to know the way the art looks, the way the characters look in the new ongoing series. How much of that is your direction, and how much of it is the artist kind of taking his own lead?
Well, it depends. There's some stories that I write, I'm actually laying out. And a lot of times, for certain types of characters, it doesn't matter who draws them. There's something intrinsic about the characters that people seem to understand, they get it right away. You know, like people get it about Snake Eyes. You know, that there's a way that he stands and the way that he moves around that almost everybody that's ever drawn him gets. You know, the same thing with Spider-Man. You know, that if Spider-Man didn't have that body language, you wouldn't buy it. You know, if he had like Green Lantern's body language, you know, wait a second, that's not right. He's not, you know, doing that. You know, or the other things that he does. He has a really distinct body language. And when people mess with that, the guys that draw this know this instinctively. They do this stuff. They go, oh, these are things that I have to stick with. This is the roadmap. And if I stray from that, then it's not going to be that character.
Last question. We haven't heard from you.
Thanks. Did you kill off certain characters in the comic depending on how much you liked or disliked writing them, such as, say, Serpentor?
No, a lot of it had to do with if I got the word from Hasbro that they weren't going to update. So there was some line of characters that like just sort of went nowhere. They weren't going to bring them back as toys. You know, I was getting to the point where I had too many characters to work with. So, well, they're not going to come back as toys. I don't like these guys. They're dead. Or they're getting discharged, or, they're going to Thule Greenland. It's their tour.
All right, well, thank you very much. We're out of time, but you are still signing autographs for the rest of the afternoon. All right, so you can find him just outside the dealer's table. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. Larry?